So, hello everybody. I suppose I have some participants now. And to all of you, a very warm welcome, wherever you are, from Berlin, Germany. This session is part of the conference Turning the COVID-19 Crisis into an Opportunity. What's next for social protection? This event has been designed as a virtual live space for learning, interaction, collaboration, and knowledge sharing on social protection, leveraging the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity to build stronger and more efficient policies. May I therefore remind you about the upcoming parts of this conference that are going to take place until tomorrow. Please do join us on further sessions as well. So for some reason now it does not, yes, it does move. Well, now it's time to introduce myself. My name is Arnold Groh. I'm psychologist, linguist, and semiotician. I'm head of the research institution, Structural Analysis of Cultural Systems, SACS in brief, which is in special consultative status with the United Nations Economic and Social Council. When there is no pandemic, I'm in the fields with indigenous peoples once or twice a year, and I also teach at universities. This session on cultural diversity and the inclusion of indigenous rights into the planning processes of social protection is one of the side events of this Social Protection e-conference. We have exactly 1 hour. I'm going to give a presentation providing a general look at the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and explaining certain aspects of this part of international law that are of particular relevance to social protection issues during this COVID-19 crisis. We shall then see that this pandemic provides a special opportunity for the practical implementation of indigenous rights. After the presentation, we are going to have a questions and answers session and some closing remarks. Please send your questions towards the end of the presentation by clicking on the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. So let me start with briefly presenting our organization. SACS stands for Structural Analysis of Cultural Systems, and we participate in sessions and other activities in the UN systems, especially in those that are highlighted on this slide. An essential part of our work is field research with traditionally living indigenous peoples, and you see some examples on this slide here. To understand the differences of cultures and what makes indigenous cultures different from our globalized culture, it is useful to have a look at cultural theories, and one concept there is that of a spectrum of cultures. It has first been proposed by Levi Strauss and has then been adopted by other theorists, of course. So the indigenous cultures and the globalized culture, they are on the different, located on the different ends of this spectrum. The indigenous cultures, they are at the extreme one end, and the globalized culture is at the extreme other end. Yet we have to bear in mind that the indigenous ways of life are typical for our species. Homo sapiens has lived on this planet for millennia in that way. This is the way humans usually live, and indigenous peoples, as long as they still live as hunter-gatherers, they live in, with, and from nature without destroying it. We do not know that anymore. Our culture, the global culture, industrial culture, the dominant one on this planet, is the most destructive culture that has ever been on the face of the earth. We have to also bear that in mind. So, but what happens? There is no peaceful coexistence that maybe we just live on one part of this planet and let the indigenous peoples live in other parts of the planet. No, it's not that way. Actually, we are extremely dominant, and the cultural dominance works in a way that presses very hard. It puts very hard social pressure on indigenous peoples, and that does not have to happen necessarily by force. We also have to be sure about that. Cultural dominance does not involve force necessarily, but rather the dominant persons, they are role models, and the transfer of behavior patterns to indigenous cultures has the effect of a modification of indigenous identities, and that then leads to the disintegration of the indigenous social systems. This is what happens worldwide. So what to do about it? There are some bodies, some entities within the UN system where we meet regularly, have sessions, and indigenous representatives from all over the world come there to claim their rights, claim their the respect and acceptance of their culture. And this is a map that a while ago was hanging in the session hall of the UN, and it depicts and lists indigenous peoples of the world. There are actually about 7,000 cultures on this planet. Most of them are indigenous. There is no actual figure of how many cultures are indigenous, because the concept of indigeneity is still under discussion. But what we can say is that 2,000 of them are severely threatened now, and that was already the case before the pandemic. Now, within the UN system, a working group was created in 1982, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations, which was in charge of compiling an amendment to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, an amendment regarding the indigenous rights. And I participated in that in the final phase from 1999 to 2006. And then in 2007, this document was adopted by the General Assembly so that it is now part of international law. We shall now have a look at some important articles of this declaration. For example, there's Article 3. It says that indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. So it is not the states or any external persons who can tell indigenous peoples what to do or not to do. But actually, this is a nice article, but the fact looks in many cases, in most cases, somewhat different. So these articles 8 and 31, they clearly say that indigenous culture has to be protected. And very often in these articles, they end by saying that states shall take care of it. States shall take effective measures, etc. Like you see here at the paragraph 2 of Article 31. And if you please have a look at Article 8, paragraph 2a, it says that any action which has the aim or effect, so let me highlight this, aim or effect of depriving them, etc. This wording was very carefully chosen, like actually the whole wording of this document is the result of very intense discussions. So as any action which has the aim or effect that prevents people from saying, oh, I didn't mean it, I didn't want to destabilize their culture, but this is not a matter of intention, if they mean to do something, but it's just the matter of the resulting effect. So anything that could even potentially have any destabilizing effect for an indigenous culture would be an infringement of international law. Article 11 is very important as well. Indigenous peoples have the right to revitalize their cultures. So some people try to argue, oh, they are backward and they need to be developed and they need progress, etc. Well, no. It is indigenous peoples who have participated in these sessions for 24 years, from 1982 to 2006. And they pointed out that they want to have the right to revitalize their culture. So they have the right to say no to progress. They have the right to say no to whatever the external world things would be good, or tells them that it would be good for them. Article 14 says that indigenous peoples have the right to educate their children and youth in their own ways. They have the right to transfer their cultural knowledge to the next generations, and so that they learn their ways, not only their languages, but also their ways of living and cultural techniques, how to live in, with, and from nature without destroying it. Then this is something actually for for the non-indigenous peoples, Articles 15 and 16 say that indigenous peoples need to be reflected correctly in media and education, because most of these cultures are neglected. They are not shown at all on TV or in the media, but when they are shown, their appearance is often adapted to what the dominant culture thinks what would be nice, how they should look, and what would be decent, how they should appear. So often these the image that is created by media of indigenous people that is manipulated or biased, and it is not the way it is, and that actually has a backlash on the indigenous peoples, because when they see themselves in the dominant media, that again has the function of being a role model for them. So indigenous cultures are actually shaped by the dominant culture, by incorrect reflections and in the dominant media and education. Land rights, that is something extremely important also in our context. Look at these articles. They basically say that they own their territories and it is theirs, and they have the right to live there. And furthermore, as you see in these articles, indigenous territories have to be protected, of course, by the states, but by obvious reasons, many states are very reluctant in doing so. They want to control these territories. Often these territories, they contain minerals. They want to have access to these resources, and even in the name of conservation, these national parks that are often created, the basic idea behind that is also economy. It's money, because tourism brings a lot of money, and especially hunting tourism brings very big money. Article 10 is actually quite obvious. None of us wants to be forcibly removed to wherever we live, but apparently it needed to be particularly stressed with regard to indigenous peoples. Indigenous peoples have the right to use their lands, and if there has been any adverse impact on their lands, that needs to be mitigated, and they have the right to redress and to compensation. By the way, you can find the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples on the internet. You can read through all the entire declaration. Now we have to go through it more quickly by highlighting some important articles. And finally, the indigenous peoples shall not be isolated by borders. Well, many of the borders outside Europe are the result of colonial times. The borders have been drawn in straight lines with rulers on the maps, dividing peoples, indigenous peoples, and separating indigenous peoples. So this is not in line with the UN declaration. Now, how to include indigenous rights into the planning processes of social protection? Well, first of all, some easy answers. Explain indigenous peoples their rights. This is what we do whenever we come to an indigenous people. The first thing we do, of course, after obtaining their consent, that is necessary, but then we explain them their rights. It should be done by the governments, but many governments do not do that. So someone has to explain them their rights. And as you can see, we do that in a minimally invasive, integrative way with total immersion. And whenever you meet indigenous peoples, you should also do that in such a total immersion way in order to make sure that you do not violate any of the indigenous rights declaration articles, any of the UN standards. And even if you orientate yourself towards the traditional appearance, then you could even do rescue work by protecting those cultures from further destabilization, and help indigenous peoples to claim their rights. One example would be the Turinfo project. We try to help indigenous peoples who want to protect their culture from destabilizing influences by tourism, by setting up those boards with information in various languages for the tourists in order to tell the tourists to behave in a minimally invasive way and adapt to the traditional culture in order not to destabilize the indigenous culture. And now, in particular, how to turn the COVID-19 crisis into an opportunity for indigenous peoples. Well, one thing that we see immediately is the problem of eviction. Eviction is an infringement of international law. Many indigenous people, actually the majority meanwhile, has been evicted from their territories. And we are in contact with some indigenous representatives, and we received emails at the beginning of the COVID-19 crisis, for example, from Uganda, where the Batwa people had been evicted from their lands, from their forests, where they could have lived in remote areas from hunting and gathering safely. They had been evicted, and before the pandemic, they survived by trying to find something to eat in the garbage because they could not hunt and gather anymore. And when there was a lockdown, they were even forbidden to go out to the garbage, so they had to starve. These are horrible things that happened there, but the solution would have been so easy. Most countries of the world have signed the declaration, though. So the indigenous peoples, they have the right to their lands. They could have just let them go back to their forests. That would have been the most easy solution. And indigenous peoples return to their forests in order to survive COVID-19. That is covered by international law. Just remember, it is a violation of international law to remove indigenous peoples from their territories in the first place. But once they are evicted, they still have their land rights, Article 26. So it is their lands and they could stay there in a very safe way. Much safer than staying in the settlements and towns where they are forced to live there. Now, and it's safer from infection and from starving, because then they could go on hunting and gathering as they did before. But the problem is that it is almost normal that indigenous peoples are evicted. Only a fraction of indigenous peoples have not been displaced from their lands. So what can we say now with regard to our question, how to turn the crisis into an opportunity, and how to include indigenous rights into the planning process of social protection? Well, in general, indigenous rights need to be included into the planning processes of social protection in order to ensure the maintenance of cultural diversity. If you don't, if you just put indigenous peoples in a refugee camp, wait for a few years and their culture will be destroyed. They will be used to food from tins. They will be used to dominant global behavior patterns. And even if they can go back, then the next generation will not be quite able to continue their culture. In particular, the present crisis should be taken as an opportunity to ensure that indigenous peoples can exercise their land rights. Their lands can be their safe havens. We should put pressure on that. Right to the embassies, right to government officials, right to organizations in charge, in order to put pressure on them to let the people go back. They have the right to do so. They don't need to be to stay there, because that would be some kind of force, but they have the right. They have the right to come and go. It is their land. So if you're interested in questions as how to translate the articles of the UN Declaration into practice, I've gone much more into detail in this book, which I therefore recommend to you. And now we are reaching the questions and answer part of our session. I shall do my best to answer as many questions as possible. And let me just stop this screen sharing to see. Well, I think I have to click on, well, I have to click on chat. And I'll wait for your questions. Well, thank you very much. We still have about half of the time for discussion. And I would love to discuss these issues with you. So please do ask your questions. No questions. How comes? Oh, yes. Thank you. I start with the first one. Yes, from my dear colleague, Mr. Akumu. Who can help indigenous people when some of their rights are violated? Well, a very difficult, tricky question, but there are some good examples. Indigenous people need legal assistance, and one good example would be the case of the Mau forest in Kenya, which was brought to court, and they have made good progress. So it looks like very soon the indigenous people, especially the Ogiek hunter-gatherers, they will be able to return to their traditional places. Yeah, the problem is that we, the globalized culture, expect from the indigenous peoples to argue within our system of thinking. But that's the only way we can have progress at the moment. We are not sufficiently ready to accept the indigenous ways of thinking. So cases have to be brought to court, and at least those countries who have signed the declaration, which is almost all countries represented in the UN, they can be we can argue on that level that there is a right for indigenous peoples, but it has to be ensured by legal measures. So then another question, let me please read it. Well, the question by Patricia Veloso. Considering that we are having a wave on conservative governments around the world, do you think it should be more difficult to find support for indigenous causes or easier? Simple but sad answer, it is going to be more difficult. But we don't know how long this will last, because our own culture is becoming more and more unstable. We had a guest lecture a while ago here at the, not too long ago, at the Technical University, and it was about climate change, and it was about the various factors bearing on that problem. And well, we have an extreme population growth at the moment. We are approaching 8 billion people on this planet. So, and the doubling times, they're becoming shorter and shorter. So in less than 15 years, we will have double that amount of persons on this planet. So we have various scenarios, optimistic ones, pessimistic ones, and some sort of in between, but all of them say that before 2100, this system is going to collapse. That's a fact. So if we don't change things radically, and then once our culture has collapsed, then hopefully some indigenous cultures will have survived somewhere. And the only chance we will then have is to learn from them. Okay, more and more questions coming in. Great. Well, what are in practice enforcement mechanisms that the UN has at its disposal to enforce these rights? Well, the UN is not a mechanism to enforce things. It's actually an assembly of states, not even of individuals, not even of groups. It's an assembly of states. And inside the UN, if you ever witness one of these sessions, there are many tensions within the UN and the various entities. It is not part of the UN agenda to enforce that. It's the states who shall enforce that. And we are in the dilemma and in the sort of paradox situation that this assembly of states called the UN has adopted the rights of indigenous peoples, and the states are in charge of enforcing them. The UN is only sort of a sort of platform where those things can be defined. And so it is the states. The states, we and each of you, each of us, should put pressures on, and the organized states and non-governmental, of course, all organizations in charge. Now, another question. Let me just read it. Yeah, the question if some Latin American governments that seem to be more in favor of indigenous peoples and their rights, that they were more successful in implementing social protection that incorporates indigenous people's rights. Yes and no. If it works, then yes, but we have to be very careful and have a close look. Once there's corruption there, and from my cooperation with Latin American partners, I'm very sorry to say that, but I have the impression that certain people are interested to participate in certain programs in order to transfer money into their own pockets. Well, there are many, many questions now. I think this is a question from Honoria Vasquez. Are there special global strategies or indigenous for indigenous peoples and COVID-19? No, as far as I know, there are no such initiatives, which is very sad. People are dying, starving, and I heard that 500 people were shot in Kenya because they went out during the lockdown. I'm just reading. Do indigenous peoples need other kinds of social protection programs that are different from typical programs such as cash transfers? Yes, of course, of course. As I pointed out, and I actually wrote that to one of these embassies, The easiest solution is to grant them their rights. It is their lands. If those governments would have let them go, they wouldn't have starved during the lockdown, because they would have been in their remote forests, much safer from any infection, and they could have fed themselves as they did before. So very good question. If in the event that a positive traditional practice that aligns with human rights has in the past been eroded due to adoption of a dominant culture, how best can an intervention reintroduce it as a positive tool for realizing particular rights? Well, we have to make sure that traditional knowledge is not lost. There has been much discussion in cultural theories and cultural semiotics about the time horizon and the information that exists in cultures. As long as the bearers of cultural information still live, we have to use that particular chance and ask them to help reconstruct exactly in detail, without any compromise, these particular practices. I don't know which exactly you are talking about or writing about, but I suppose it is those that, what you say, that aligns with human rights. Yes, of course, those should be strengthened and should be picked up from those who still know it, from the elders, from the older people of the particular communities, and help them to transfer their knowledge transgenerationally to the younger ones. What role can indigenous people play in providing social protection services to their own communities? How can these community-based be enhanced? Well, they are trying to. One of our contacts, he understood that from his simple, or from their simple position of being an indigenous people, they don't have sufficient influence. So his idea is to send a few people of his community for legal training so that they can become lawyers, and then go on and have a seat in their country's government to help their people, and to help and ensure the observation of indigenous rights. Well, just within their communities, they are in the normal situation evicted. They are exposed to external dominance. But that might be a smart way to sort of to extend one's influence and have one's people in the local governments. How to understand and communicate this in the context. Well, the question by Charlotte Barlow, I hope I pronounced it correctly, was how can the concept of social protection in the context of indigenous people be communicated. Well, that's what I'm trying to do right now. Perhaps people that function as multiplicators, like teachers, lecturers, they should bring that into the educational discourse to their students, so that the generation which now has to take over the very heavy burden that we leave to them, that they can imply those concepts and those perspectives into their policies. What are some shocks indigenous people are facing in the wake of climate change, losing their lands? Or is it the other way around? We can learn from them. Yes, exactly. We should learn from them. So I first answer the second part of this question. Now, I would like to give you an example. The European expansion has led to what we now call globalization. It started about 500 years ago, and Europeans went to other parts of the world, and instead of integrating into those cultures, and for example, those ways of feeding oneself, nutrition, they usually cut down the forest and try to transfer agriculture from Europe to other parts of the world. Now, there was one colleague in the US, Christopher Ewell, who did something that was very interesting. He said, okay, we can measure the efficiency of that. We can measure how much protein can be produced in 1 acre of what had been rainforest before. So you went there and measured and had a certain figure how much protein that acre, where before there had been rainforest, it had been cut down, now there was agriculture, how much protein it produced in 1 year. Then he went to 1 acre of pristine rainforest. And he said, now let us measure the output of protein of that forest. That was very difficult, because there are hundreds of thousands of species living there. Most of them are not even sufficiently known, maybe not known at all, many of them. But he said, let's start. So in 1 acre of pristine rainforest, you usually only have about 5 big trees of Brazil nut trees. He said, let's start with that. So out of these hundreds of thousands of species, he went to measure the output of just these 5 trees in 1 acre of rainforest. And these 5 trees, they produce more protein than you can produce in 1 acre where the rainforest had been cut down. So what we do actually is irrational. We should have learned from indigenous peoples. We should have let the rainforest be there where it is. And the rainforest does not only produce Brazil nuts, it produces so many different fruits and nuts, etc. So the output, protein output and other output is much higher than you can do with agriculture. But now, what are some shocks in the wake of climate change? Yes, climate change, of course. What shall they do when their forest dries out? And often that is accelerated. To give you the example of the Xingu National Park, Xingu is one of the hotspots of the world. There are 14 different indigenous peoples living there. 3 of them had been rescued from other places in Brazil by the Boas brothers that had been brought there, and 11 had been living there before. Anyway, now when you approach the Xingu area by air, you can see the lush green, and it's a very sharp division, the border of the national park. Inside, lush green; outside, it's a grayish green desert of fields where they produce genetically manipulated soybeans. So near this Xingu Park, a dam had been built, Belo Monte, and although there was no river, a dam had been built for producing electricity, although there was no river. So what they did then is they said, okay, we're going to take the Xingu River and divert it to fill the dam. So what will happen now is the forest will dry out, and people are very specialized. Some are only hunting particular species, others are hunting another species. So they don't take each other species away. And some are specialized in fishing, for example. The first people to suffer are those who live from fishing. When the river dries out and there's no more river because it is diverted, they will have to go and, collect fruits from other people's lands and maybe even start hunting, although they're not used to it. They were specialized to fish. There will be conflicts. And then soon after that, when the forest will dry out, they all will have to face the choice either to starve or to go and become cheap labor for the factories around the dam. This is a very clever way, you take away the water, and then the people have to come in order to survive, and they will be workers in this factory. Quickly, because we're approaching the end. Do you believe that being part of national protection, I think it's you mean causing indigenous people to lose their authentic culture? Yes, yes. How can they be part of and still preserve? Why should they be part of the dominant system? Look at what we're doing with this planet. We're destroying it. We are the most destructive culture ever that has lived on this planet. Why should they become part of it? If they are partially part of it, like only a few days of the week, in order to help their people and in order to be a representative in the government, then yeah, we have to respect them so they have some self-respect. How shall they have self-respect when as long as the dominant culture looks down on them, says, oh, you're primitive, you're backward, etc. We have to respect these people. Now, quickly, one of the challenges, well, the question, what can we do? By the way, can you also read these questions so I don't have to read them for you? I don't hear you, so. Well, the second last question, the answer would be land rights. Make sure they can exercise their land rights. And then regarding the displacement, very good question. What do you think about using the international criminal justice system? Yes, it should be used. The Human Rights Court and yeah, ICC. Yeah, of course, the international system. Yes, those governments should be brought before these courts, but the problem is that they have ways of evading that, of threatening other governments involved and put sanctions on them. Yes, the idea is great. I think any infringement of indigenous rights should be prosecuted within the international criminal system, but it will be very, very difficult, and I hope all of you will come up with ideas how to translate that into action. Now, I think we are approaching the end, but you can still find my email address somewhere. So if you want to continue this discourse, you are more than welcome. And now I switch back to the screen. Oh, I still have so many in the chat. Yeah, no, it was the question. Okay, I thank you all for the participation. And as I said, if you want to continue, please don't hesitate to contact me. And please, I would like to remind you to please answer the session survey that will appear at the end at your screens after you have closed the session window. And let me also remind you of the program for tomorrow. So you're very welcome to participate in those. I think we have reached the end of this session. I thank you very much, very much for joining this session. And well, I wish you all the best and much strength in doing the best you can wherever you are. Okay, bye-bye.